Alright, YouTube, for those of you who are paying attention, of course, there was a briefing by John Kerry, Secretary of State, former senator, presidential candidate, on the Syria situation, and then reporters asked a bunch of questions of the White House spokesperson. I can boil down Kerry's argument, and it was clearly a pro-war argument. There's no question about it. The contradictions were quite severe. I can boil down his argument as to why, oh, America needs to intervene, and here's his argument boiled down. The videos are terrible, dead children, my feelings, my emotions. It's undeniable that Assad was the one who gassed his people. There's no question in our minds. He went on, saying these emotional arguments, and you know what the purpose is. The purpose is to elicit an emotional response from the American people through the media, which is right now warmongering too, to get them to want war. Because right now polls show 60% of Americans are opposed to it, and only 9% are actually for any sort of intervention of any kind, by the way. That number doesn't even jump up much higher when you factor in chemical weapons being used and provably so by Assad. Because right now what you are seeing is Iraq 2.0. It's the same difference. By the way, story just came out that declassified documents showed that the CIA actually was aware of Saddam's gassing campaigns in advance and actually helped him out on several different occasions with logistics to fight the Iranians when he gassed them. So we know it's happened before. And here's Kerry saying anyone who thinks that these videos were manufactured or weren't true needs to check their conscience. No, I think John Kerry needs to check his conscience. This is a man who in 2004, when he was running against Bush, spent the majority of his campaign on the one platform of we shouldn't be in Iraq, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, civilians are dying, there's no evidence of WMDs. All of these things that he said back then that everyone conveniently forgets in the media, and thankfully I'll get to the White House spokesperson being grilled, which is a much better story. Here's a man who was completely anti-war. He was a complete peacenik at the time when he was running for the presidency against a warmongering president in the first place, suddenly switching sides and telling us, well, we need to think of the children and think my emotions, my feelings. You can't watch these videos and think that we shouldn't have a strong response. But even Kerry himself never explicitly stated we know that Assad's the one who used these weapons. What you see now is a warmongering, and the idea is of plausible deniability. The idea is, well, we think Assad used these weapons, so we're going to go over and bomb some soft targets and take out some guns and missile stations, and we'll let the rebels steamroll Assad. It's warmongering. The American people largely are saying we don't want another war. We can't afford another war. It's going to be vastly even less popular than the Iraq war. And guess what? There are also reports saying that the Syrians right now are aiming their weapons at Israel, and that the Iraqis and Lebanese, I can't remember whether it was Lebanon or Jordan, that they're all clamoring that in the event that Syria is attacked, Iran and all of these other countries are going to attack our men, our aircraft, and then attack Israel, which is a very real possibility. And I think if you ever saw Iran really ramp up its war machine, it would be a sight to behold, and I don't think it would be anything like shock and awe, where we quickly surpassed Saddam's ability to retaliate. But here you've got, literally on the same day, reports coming out about how the CIA knew that Saddam was gassing people and did absolutely nothing back in the 1980s, because back then he was our little dictator freedom fighter attacking the Iranians, who we originally supported, then decided, no, we're going to support Saddam. Then it was, no, we hate Saddam because he's a butcher, when he started gassing things we didn't want him to gas. And then it was, now it's, well, Iran is part of the axis of evil again. It's ridiculous. Anyone can see through these lies. If you just stop allowing their stupid emotional arguments to influence your judgment. It doesn't matter that people, I hate to say it, it does not matter that people were gassed in Syria. What matters is who did the gassing. there's plenty of evidence to suggest it was not Assad. If it wasn't Assad and the rebels use gas, what do we gain from attacking Assad's targets? What do we gain? Nothing. And here's the White House spokesperson here taking questions from reporters who, one of the dudes was from AP and he was grilling her harder than anything I've ever seen. They're basically saying, so you're saying that you know that chemical weapons were used, and let's face it, they probably were used. But you don't know who used them. That matters. And here are these idiots standing there lying to the American public saying essentially it doesn't matter who used them. Well, it must have been Assad because we've judged that the rebels aren't capable of using chemical weapons. Why? Chemical weapons can be used by a small rebel group. All they've got to do is get it supplied by somebody else. Or they've got to capture chemical weapons from Assad, which, let's face it, they probably could have already done. So this bitch is standing up there lying to the American people and getting called out time and time again by the press, which was hilarious. And here's Kerry being a complete hypocrite the entire time. He didn't even speak very long, although it was characteristically boring as usual. He spent the entire time in one big emotional appeal. If this was a properly structured debate, he would have lost based on the fact that his argument had absolutely no real logical substance. All it was think of the children. Think of all the innocent civilians dying. Yeah, weapons are bad. Yeah, people aren't, according to international law, aren't supposed to use them. The problem is we don't know who used them. And for Kerry to come out and say that people need to check their consciences because they suspect fairly reasonably that those videos were manufactured by rebel groups as propaganda, which is a very real possibility, and that the rebels themselves were the ones gassing people, is ridiculous. John Kerry was being a complete hypocrite. And as I said, here's this former peacenik from the Iraq era, the middle of the Iraq era, the 2007 to 2008 period, who stood in the way of every possible operation and said we should withdraw, we should have more diplomacy, we don't need to be bombing all these targets, we're not accomplishing anything, we're wasting money. He was right. In 2004, if he applied the same logic he used then to the situation now, he would come logically to the conclusion that we should do nothing about Syria. And that's what we should do. Number one, to respect the wishes of the American people who have made it very clear they do not support this war. Number two, because we do not have proper evidence, and the UN investigators are in there looking at the evidence right now. What does Kerry say? Well, it's too late. It's too late to dig up proper evidence because we're not going to accept the UN investigators' evidence because it's too late to determine who used them. You couldn't have determined that to begin with. It's very likely that if the stockpiles Assad has have been compromised by rebels, that any use of chemical weapons in that region would automatically look like Assad was the one that greenlighted it. And then you have Israeli intelligence saying, oh, we overheard Damascus's conversation talking about how to use the gas against the rebels. My goodness, that's not evidence. Israel has a vested interest in our troops being on the ground in Syria. They're a biased source. I wouldn't trust that as far as I can throw it, and neither would Kerry if he knew what he was talking about. The biggest issue here, though, is Kerry's hypocrisy. He's basically saying, let's go to war with Syria. By the way, I was against war with Iraq, even though it was under the exact same situation. You have claims of WMDs that, let's face it, a few years from now, if we go into Syria, we'll probably find a similar situation to what we found in Iraq. That is, that chemical weapons were present in very small quantities. They were largely unused, largely useless, old surplus that probably wasn't even chemically reactive at the time. That's what we're going to find. You have the same emotional appeals. Well, Saddam is part of the axis of evil. Well, Assad's part of the axis of evil. You have the same unsubstantiated claims that we need to go in because they're funding terrorists. Oh, well, Assad's terrorizing the region. No, the FSA is terrorizing the region. People who in large part aren't even Syrian, who do have access to chemical weapons. If you think chemical weapons in the Middle East are hard to find for any military group that wants them, you're crazy. You can buy a crate of hand grenades in Afghanistan for $40. Probably less. You can buy fully functional Soviet 80s and 90s era surplus automatic rifles. You can buy all sorts of good stuff. Body armor. You could probably buy a tank over there if you wanted to, if you had the money. You can buy child slaves and opium by the pound, too. The Middle East is full of weapons. There's no way to tell who used the chemicals. I doubt that they have proper intelligence on the ground to determine it. It looks like disinfo. This is just a bunch of pro-war propaganda. Now, I said it back during the Bush administration's period of time when we went into Iraq. And when we went into Afghanistan, too, because let's face it, there was really no purpose of going in. They already probably knew Osama had left for Pakistan, but Pakistan's an ally, so we can't do it, and they have nukes, so we can't do anything over there. And we finally had to go into Pakistan to get Osama bin Laden, even though we had spent a decade in Afghanistan wandering around allowing people to grow opium. This makes no sense. This is warmongering. I said it then and I'll say it now. We shouldn't have gone into Afghanistan. We shouldn't have gone into Iraq. The economy was fragile at the time. It fucked up our economy. We wasted trillions of dollars. We're going to waste hundreds of billions of dollars, I'm sure, in Syria. And it looks inevitable that we're going to do the same thing that we did in Iraq. Remember, when we went into Iraq, we didn't start off by putting troops on the ground. It started off with missiles, and then it transitioned from just bombing them from offshore. A few weeks later, we started flying sorties. And then a while later, our troops landed. We're going to do the same thing in Syria. Then we'll probably allow Assad to get beheaded or hung, like we did with Saddam Hussein, so that he can never speak up. All of these things, it just smacks completely of propaganda. And I said it then, and I'll say it now. The reason we're in this country is primarily to control oil moving through the region, partially to pressure the Russians, partially to pressure the Iranians. I hope that if we get involved, the Iranians and Russians and Hezbollah and all of these groups, they figure, they went into Afghanistan, Iraq, and kicked out our allies there, and lied to their people and wasted, trillions of dollars. Now they're doing it in Syria. Who are they going to go after next? Iran. Of course. Again, dinner plate contains Syria currently. Dessert for later, the midnight snack, is Iran. Hopefully the Iranians realize what's happening and actually land their troops in Syria too, because then it will turn into a butcher fest. We'll lose a hell of a lot of lives. You'll see Russia get involved very quickly, and it will go into a stalemate, because we don't need to be world police all the time. The American people have spoken. They don't want war. They distrust the government, and frankly, everything Kerry said was untrustworthy. None of it was believable. None of it made factual sense. There was no discussing real intel. All it was one long emotional appeal. We don't need to be involved in Syria. Let Assad and the rebels duke it out. If chemical weapons are used, here's another thing that I'll say that might be mildly unpopular. It's no worse to use chemical weapons than to use any other form of military warfare weapons. It's no different. Does it really matter whether you get shot in the chest and slowly bleed to death, or whether you suffocate because you got attacked with mustard gas? Or whether you suddenly spasm on the ground because you got hit with sarin? Does it really? They're still dying. It makes absolutely no difference. The only difference is this time it was a civilian population, but civilians always die in war in the Middle East. 500,000 civilians died in Iraq while we were there. We've still got some people there, but during the active period of struggle in Iraq, 500,000 people died. And Bush never shed a tear. He didn't care. And Obama never shed a tear and didn't care. They don't care when you use a drone strike in Yemen and a couple dozen civilians die. Nobody in the media cares. But suddenly Assad supposedly kills civilians, which we don't even have proof he did, and all of a sudden we've got to cry and carry on, and we've got to go and spend money and lives and time in Syria. It makes no sense. We should all be united in a severely anti-war stance. Now, at this point, anyone who joins the National Guard right now is a warmongering dumbass.